At 12:13 p.m., nothing was wrong. No enemy ships, no alarms, no warning. 30 seconds later, 768 sailors were dead, and the Imperial Japanese Navy would never explain why. On June 8, 1943, the Japanese battleship Mutsu was sitting quietly at anchor in Hiroshima Bay. The sea was calm. The sky was clear. There was no sign of danger. Mutsu was not a frontline ship at that moment. She was a symbol, one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most powerful battleships. Over 29,000 tons of steel, armed with massive 16-inch guns, crewed by nearly 1,500 sailors, many of them young conscripts who believed they were serving aboard an untouchable giant. Lunch had just ended for much of the crew. Some sailors were cleaning compartments below deck. Others were resting in the heat, writing letters, joking quietly, waiting for the afternoon routine to resume. Officers reviewed paperwork. Engineers monitored gauges. Everything was ordinary. Then, without warning, the ship detonated from the inside. A violent explosion ripped upward through the forward magazines. The blast was so powerful that witnesses on nearby ships described the deck of Mutsu lifting into the air before disintegrating. A towering column of smoke and fire shot skyward, followed by debris raining back into the bay. Within seconds, the pride of the Imperial Navy was broken in half. Sailors were thrown into the water by the shockwave. Others were trapped below deck as compartments collapsed and seawater flooded in. Nearby ships rushed to respond, but even as they moved closer, they could see the truth. Mutsu was dying. From the moment of the explosion to the ship's final sinking, less than 5 minutes passed. When the water finally closed over the wreck, 768 sailors were dead. No enemy had fired a shot. No battle had taken place. No warning had been issued. Japan had just suffered one of the deadliest naval disasters in its history, and almost no one outside the Navy would ever be told what really happened. Before we go further, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. These stories take time to research and tell properly, and your support helps keep them alive. In the immediate aftermath, chaos spread across Hiroshima Bay. Rescue boats pulled survivors from the water. Many burned, many injured, some in shock, unable to explain what they had just witnessed. Officers tried to establish order, but confusion reigned. No one could agree on what had caused the blast. Some sailors insisted they had heard 2 explosions. Others swore the ship had been struck from below. A few whispered a word no one wanted to say out loud: sabotage. The Imperial Japanese Navy moved quickly, not to explain the disaster, but to contain it. The wreck site was sealed off. Survivors were ordered to remain silent. Families of the dead were given vague explanations: an accident during training, a mechanical failure, an unfortunate incident. The word explosion was avoided. Official reports were classified. Newspapers were forbidden from mentioning details. Even many senior officers were denied access to the investigation's findings. Japan was at war, and morale was everything. The idea that one of the Navy's most powerful battleships could simply explode at anchor without enemy action was unacceptable. But beneath the surface, an uncomfortable question lingered. How does a battleship designed to withstand enemy shells destroy itself in peacetime conditions? As divers descended into the murky waters around the wreck, they found something disturbing. The explosion originated near the forward magazines, where shells and propellant were stored. But there was no clear evidence of an external cause. No torpedo damage, no mine fragments, no signs of attack. Which meant the danger had come from inside the ship itself. Rumors began circulating quietly among naval personnel. Some blamed faulty ammunition. Others suspected poor handling of propellant charges.
A darker theory suggested intentional sabotage, perhaps by a disgruntled sailor or even ideological dissent. In wartime Japan, such thoughts were dangerous. To question discipline was to question loyalty. To question loyalty was to invite punishment. So the Navy chose silence. Mutsu was officially removed from the active fleet. Her name faded from public discussion. The dead were honored privately, without explanation. The wreck was left on the seabed, broken and unresolved. But the truth had not disappeared. It was waiting, in damaged steel, in classified files, and in the memories of those who survived the moment when, at 12:13 p.m., everything went wrong. In the next chapter, we'll examine what investigators secretly discovered inside the wreck and why the Imperial Navy feared the real cause of the explosion more than any enemy attack.
In the days following the explosion, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched one of the most secretive investigations of the war. Officially, Mutsu had been lost to an internal accident. Unofficially, senior commanders were terrified of what might be found. Divers were dispatched to the wreck almost immediately. They descended into dark, oil-stained water, guided only by ropes and faint light. What they encountered was not a ship, but a graveyard of twisted steel. The forward section of Mutsu was completely obliterated. Armor plates weighing dozens of tons had been peeled outward as if they were paper. This was not the pattern of an external attack. It was the signature of an explosion that began inside the magazine itself. Investigators recovered fragments of shell casings and propellant containers. Some showed signs of abnormal heat exposure, far beyond what should have occurred under normal storage conditions. The propellant used by the Imperial Navy was powerful, but notoriously unstable if mishandled or improperly manufactured. This raised an alarming possibility. If the explosion had been caused by defective ammunition, then Mutsu was not unique. Other battleships, Nagato, Yamato, Musashi, used similar propellant and storage methods, which meant the danger might be systemic. The Navy convened a closed inquiry composed of senior officers, engineers, and ordnance specialists. Their discussions were never recorded publicly, but fragments of testimony survived in post-war documents. One conclusion surfaced again and again. The most likely cause was spontaneous ignition of propellant powder. In simple terms, the ship may have blown itself apart because the ammunition had become chemically unstable. But even that explanation carried consequences the Navy could not afford. Admitting a manufacturing flaw would mean acknowledging that Japanese war industry, already strained by shortages and bombing, was producing unsafe munitions. It would also force inspections across the fleet, potentially grounding battleships at a time when Japan could least afford it. So the findings were buried. The report was classified at the highest level. Only a handful of officers were allowed to read it. Survivors were instructed never to discuss the incident in detail. Some were reassigned to distant units. Others were quietly discharged. And yet, silence did not stop speculation. Among sailors, rumors spread anyway. Some whispered that a crewman had committed suicide, intentionally detonating the magazine. Others believed careless handling during routine maintenance had sparked the blast. A few suspected political dissent, a dangerous thought in wartime Japan. None of these claims could be proven, but what mattered was not which theory was true. What mattered was that the Navy never wanted the public to ask the question at all. Even the families of the dead were kept in the dark. Many received notices stating their sons or husbands had died in the line of duty. There were no details, no explanations, no acknowledgement that their loved ones had died not in combat, but in an accident caused by internal failure. For a nation built on honor and sacrifice, this ambiguity was devastating. If you're finding this story valuable so far, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. These hidden chapters of history are often forgotten because they were meant to stay buried. As the war progressed, Mutsu became an unspoken warning inside the Navy. Safety procedures around ammunition were quietly revised, storage conditions were altered, inspections became more frequent, though no one ever said why. The irony was hard to ignore. While Japan poured immense resources into building massive warships to dominate the seas, one of its most powerful vessels had been destroyed not by an enemy, but by the very system meant to sustain it. By 1944, as American forces advanced across the Pacific, the loss of Mutsu took on new meaning. Every battleship mattered, every trained sailor mattered, and yet 800 men had been lost without firing a single shot. The wreck remained on the seabed, partially salvaged but never fully raised. It was easier to leave it where it lay, a reminder of vulnerability, a symbol of concealed failure, a story that did not fit the heroic narrative of the war. But history has a way of resurfacing what was meant to stay hidden. In the final chapter, we'll look at how the disaster was remembered after the war, what later investigations revealed, and why Mutsu remains one of the most unsettling naval mysteries of World War II.
When World War II ended in August 1945, Japan was forced to confront realities it had long tried to hide. Cities lay in ruins, the Imperial Navy had ceased to exist, and classified records, once protected by secrecy and fear, began to surface. Among them were references to Mutsu. For the first time, former officers and engineers were able to speak more openly. Internal Navy memoranda, recovered and studied by post-war historians, confirmed what many had suspected. There was no evidence of enemy action. The explosion had been internal, sudden, and catastrophic. Later analyses pointed again to unstable propellant charges stored in the forward magazine. Japanese naval propellant of the era, particularly certain batches manufactured under wartime pressure, was prone to chemical degradation. Heat, humidity, or minor handling errors could trigger ignition. On Mutsu, all the conditions may have aligned at once. The result was instantaneous destruction. Yet even after the war, no single individual or decision was officially blamed. There was no court-martial, no public apology, no clear accountability. The dead remained statistics, 768 names etched quietly into memorials, rarely mentioned in textbooks. In the 1950s and 60s, partial salvage operations were conducted. Large sections of Mutsu were raised from the seabed, including gun barrels, armor plating, and fragments of the hull. These relics were placed in museums, stripped of context, presented as artifacts rather than evidence. Visitors could see the steel, but not the failure. For surviving crew members, the silence was heavy. Some spoke privately to historians, describing the moment of the blast, the sound, the pressure, the sudden darkness. Others refused to discuss it at all, carrying the memory alone for decades. One survivor described it simply: "We were not defeated by an enemy. We were defeated by trust, in our ship, in our systems, in the belief that it could not happen." Today, Mutsu occupies a strange place in history. She was not sunk in battle, she did not fall to superior firepower, she was lost in an instant of internal collapse. And that may be why her story is uncomfortable. It challenges the idea that strength is always visible. It reveals how secrecy can be as destructive as enemy fire. And it reminds us that even the mightiest machines are vulnerable to the smallest failures. At 12:13 p.m., there was no warning, no alarm, no countdown, just an ordinary moment that became irreversible. The explosion of Mutsu is more than a naval accident. It is a lesson about systems pushed beyond their limits, about institutions that value image over truth, and about the human cost of silence. When disasters are hidden, their lessons are delayed. When questions are suppressed, the same mistakes repeat. The men aboard Mutsu did not die in combat, but their story deserves to be remembered with the same weight. Because history is not only shaped by battles, it is shaped by what nations choose to admit or conceal. If this story changed how you see World War II, leave a comment below and share what stood out to you most. Make sure to subscribe for more untold moments from history, and click the video on screen to continue exploring the hidden side of the past. Until next time.